I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You dare once in your life.
Hey, people. Trish Wood here. And this is a very, very special show. It's one that I have had in the works for a while, and I'd actually intended it to run in March because it was a kind of a COVID anniversary, or let's just say COVID memorial or something. An anniversary sounds like something you should be celebrating, but what happened was a whole bunch of news stories occurred, like the Kelly J. Keane story and Billboard Chris, and I kind of got into that for a couple of shows. I felt it was important and a tipping point, which clearly it was, because if you watch the follower accounts on some of these people who are speaking out, they're going up and up. And that's really great. But what it meant was that I was holding on to one of the best interviews I think we've ever had around here on Trish Wood is Critical. And it happened for a bunch of reasons. The interviewee is my old friend Jeffrey Tucker. And as you know, Jeffrey has been on the show a multitude of times talking about COVID policy. He was also the facilitator of the Great Barrington Declaration with Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kaldorf, and Sunetra Gupta. He was the guy in whose institute the meeting took place and the document and the ideas for focused protection went forth. So what's interesting about Jeffrey is that even though you've heard him on my show before, I want you to understand one thing that's really important about him. Actually, a couple of things. He was one of the first people to really be speaking out about the folly of lockdowns and school closures and how dumb the science was and how dangerous it was for people. And understand, Jeffrey doesn't talk about this very much, but he paid a price for that, as did many of the people I call COVID heroes on the program from time to time. There are a lot of people, a ton of people now saying what we were saying 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago when it was dangerous, right? And it's great that they're saying it now, but they weren't saying it then. Only a very few people were saying it then. They are the fearless, critical thinkers who are incapable of sitting around watching a slow motion catastrophe happen to the world and to us without speaking up. They spoke up, and Jeffrey Tucker was one of the people who did that. And so what's magnificent about Jeffrey is that he has kind of a background in studying pandemics, so he was right up to speed on all the nonsense. He's also a terrific writer and a prolific writer. I'm embarrassed at his output. It's amazing. And he now runs something called the Brownstone Institute. He left the place he was at when they put the Great Barrington Declaration together. And that's a story for him to talk about, not me. So he left there, founded the Brownstone Institute, and it became a home for the best writing, the best thinking, the coolest people involved on the heretical side of COVID. It's also a nut-free zone. So the really, really extreme voices who are cashing in without anything much to say of substance or credibility don't write for Brownstone. Brownstone curates their people, and they're good people and they're smart people. So that's what he did in the face of adversity, in the face of all of this horror that we have been facing for 3 years. And as you know, all of you have experienced not just the horror of the lockdowns and the horror of the school closures and the horror of the isolation, but also the horror of the cruelty when our brothers and sisters in our own communities turned against us. That's what made it worse for me. And I'll never forget my friend Ann Brower saying what I think might be the line of the whole pandemic, which was, as a Jewish person, my parents always told me to have friends who would hide me in the attic if it was necessary, right? That great, great phrase. And she also took risks to speak out in her town of Minneapolis, which was very left-wing, and a state that was very COVIDian. So let's remember Ann Bauer, too, who I also met. She came up here for my film to be interviewed, as did Jeffrey. And that is, in a sense, what informs what you're going to hear today. Jeffrey and I are no longer kind of colleague. We've become friends. It's hard not to be friends with Jeffrey. He swept into my apartment in a very dramatic cape with a big smile on his face and gave me a very important and encyclopedic interview for the film we're doing on COVID-19. He's just a lovely human being. But because we met in person and I got to know more of his human side, the interview you're about to hear does peel back some layers on this man who's been to hell and back in publicizing, writing about, and helping to enable the good people in this fight against COVID, darkness, and tyranny. So this is a really, really special interview. It's about 2 hours long, sorry, but, if you listen to the show on walks or in the tub or where I know people long car drives, this is one where you really want to do that. So I'm not going to talk too long. I'm going to let our interview do the talking for you today and just fill in some of the blanks before we throw to the interview. One of them is obviously my pitch. And I want to remind you that we have a move afoot to get all of our wonderful supporters totally onto Substack because it is a free speech platform. So when you're ready, dump out of your Patreon and PayPal and head over to Substack. That's where the community is really expressing itself. Just come on over. The comments are open to everybody, whether you're a paid subscriber or not. And the print stories so far have been open to everybody. We've done a couple of premium podcasts there too. One of them was Colonel Douglas McGregor. The other one was Seymour Hersh. Both worth paying a little bit of money to listen to, I think. So do come over there. Understand you are supporting independent journalism here. I pay the people who work for me. I don't have any little freebie interns running around. Everybody gets paid because I believe in that. And your support helps me do that. You can find my Substack, which is called Trish Wood is Critical, just like the podcast, just by giving it a good old Google. It comes right up. Our SEO is working on some of these things, finally. We're moving up the ranks in the Google lists, thank goodness. My website is trishwoodpodcast.com. There's a merch button there. We're going to be doing an adult human female cap for you to wear on the dock this summer. If you're going to the cottage or wherever, you might be wearing a pretty little baseball cap for our female listeners who I know are all in on this. So we're going to do a hashtag adult human female for y'all in the merch store coming by the end of next week. And that money goes to also help support the podcast. There is a funny little button on there too, where I don't know how much it is, but I'll do a greeting for you. If you have a grandmother or somebody who really likes the show, I'm happy to do a greeting. I do it free, but Dorothea wouldn't let me do that. She's always kind of cracking the whip, and she's right to. But we're happy to do those things. So go there if you want something like that. And my Twitter, where you should be if you're not, is at Wood Reporting, because we do a little bit of news over there and a lot of bitching. But it's elevated bitching. But look, I love-hate relationship with Twitter, but I find a lot of interesting stories on there, and I meet a lot of interesting people, including Ann Bauer, on Twitter. So you should be on there. Just curate your exposure to it and don't argue with bad people. It goes nowhere. Just stick with us. Find us and stick with us. Anyway, it's Wood Reporting is my handle. Please subscribe to me and you'll see my tweets. So that's Substack. And do move your account to Substack. If I haven't said that, please do that if you can. And you will be seeing everything that we're doing. We're doing that now through Substack. Comes in the mail to y'all. You'll get an email about it. So I also want to talk just for a minute about some of the trans extremism coverage I've been doing. I'll just be a second. I had a little bit of pushback from some of the men about calling myself a feminist, and I wrote a long response to that in the comments section of, I believe it was in the Ugly Truth About Pretty Women post, which was my latest. It's quite a good one, actually. We have a lot of good research in there. And I'm just going to say this. I'll be in trouble with everybody for saying it, but I'm going to say it. I know a lot of men think feminism went too far, and I sat back and I watched some movements within the feminist framework where it became very dangerous to be a man. I think the Me Too movement went too far. I think innocent men were caught up in it. I think minor infractions did not warrant some of the canceling that was done here. We can't live in a world where different sexes are hating each other, and I don't operate that way. I've got 2 grown men as my children, and I support young men wholeheartedly. But I did grow up in a town where men, or not in a town, I did grow up at a time when men could still, there was a marital exemption. They could still rape their wives. I'm going to be posting some advertising from back in the day of men literally with their foot on a woman's head to sell shoes or something. I mean, that's where I come from. And I was also the first in some of the places I worked doing the job I was doing. And that was a real challenge because a lot of the men there didn't want to give that up. You know, who is this woman here? So I had to navigate that, and I did it with kindness and grace. But because of that, I do call myself a feminist. Many feminists would say I'm not a feminist, by the way. But don't just attack the word, because it means different things to different women. I think we all feel under attack from trans extremism. We do. They're erasing us. Dylan Mulvaney is literally erasing us in the commercial space right now. All these big corporations are trying to elevate their ESG score so they can get better funding by pandering to this movement. And that's driven in part by BlackRock, by the way. So that's what we're fighting against. And I'll say here what I said last week. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't agree on everything. And we can't agree, and we never will, and we shouldn't agree on everything. But this is a big issue defining our lives. It's not unlike COVID, and I'll tell you why I'm so hot to trot on it. It's exactly like COVID in many ways, right? The science is flawed. It's being pushed by groupthinky academics and universities who have it completely wrong. They don't acknowledge their mistakes. You cannot challenge what they've gone wrong. They completely shut down and start throwing epithets at you, right? Transphobic is the same as anti-vaxxer. All of this is anti-science, and all of it exposes the managerial class. So please don't get bogged down because I use the F word about myself. I think you know me better than that. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them for sure. And do also leave a voicemail if you want to, and we can maybe have it out on the show. There's a tab on my website, trishwoodpodcast.com. You can leave me a voicemail. As long as it's polite, I'll play it. But, yeah, so we don't all agree. It's like saying the black community. Black people don't all agree either, and women don't all agree. So that's why I have been doing this. The other thing that's happened as a result of this kind of tipping point against trans extremism is that people are saying, oh, you should interview Jennifer Belak from the 11th Hour. Already did. The problem with doing a show like mine is that we are ahead of the curve almost always on every story. And I'm not bragging about that. It's because I am a news person by trade. I hate being late, and I can sniff out an oncoming story or cultural event like a bloodhound. And so we had Jennifer Belak on. It's episode 123. You can find her there. We had Kelly J. Keane on just recently, February 10th. We had Helen Joyce on episode 127. Julie Bindel, one of the original hardcore feminists fighting this battle, is episode 29. Abigail Schreier, who wrote the book about young women and social contagion causing trans conversions, is episode 54. And Billboard Chris is episode 153. And I had him on earlier on a show, the number I can't remember. So A lot of people write to me and say, when are you going to have Abigail Shriver on? I already did. Check the archives beforehand. Just Google the name of the guest you want and my name, Trish Wood, and you'll see if I've done it, because it does come up in the Google searches. So I don't mind re-interviewing people, and I will. I'm just saying that we're quite on top of things around here, and proud to be so. And you can rely on that. I want you guys to be the first people to know some of these complicated issues that maybe you haven't thought too much about. And I think my listeners, by the time this tipping point hit with Kelly J and Chris being beaten up that way, which seems to have been a bit of a tipping point, if you've been following the show, you'll know a lot about this issue by now. So that is that. Okay, let's get to Jeffrey Tucker here. I've never called him Jeff. He's much too formal. But here's Jeffrey. He's very, very refined compared to me. He listens to Mahler, which I didn't even know who Mahler was until I started watching Woody Allen movies. I mean, I wasn't brought up in a shack, and my mother did take us to ballet and symphony, but Mahler was a bridge too far. So that's one of Jeffrey's things. We talk about music and how we were affected. Our taste in music and our reaction to music was affected by the COVID lockdowns. A very interesting discussion. And we also talked about something I think a lot of people who listen to me, I know it's true because you've told me, were very, very down. And even Jeffrey had a couple of dark nights of the soul that I don't believe he's spoken about publicly before, but we did talk about our mutual life-threatening sadness. Let's put it that way. And then the other thing I just want to share with you, and then off we go, is that you'll hear me in the interview with Jeffrey dancing around an issue with my son that happened during the lockdowns. And it's his story to tell, but he has given me permission to mention what happened, because he and I are going to address it all in a kind of a no-holds-barred mom and son, and how absolutely horrific COVID was for our family. Together, Tom and I are going to do it together. We have a really good relationship, and we speak well on issues. You'll remember that we did a program together, podcast on the suicide of Anthony Bourdain, and how it very likely was connected to the fact that he never actually got sober. He was an addict, a using addict all of his adult life. He may have given up heroin, but he was drinking and carrying on. And that means he's not sober. And not being sober for an addict like Tony Bourdain can bring a lot of darkness into the life. I don't know why he never got 12-step, but that's neither here nor there, I guess, now. Just very sad. But in that interview, you would have heard us kind of talking about how our sobriety seemed pretty solid, right? And not long after that, I'm allowed to say this now, Thomas had a very serious relapse. Had a very serious relapse and nearly died in my apartment, actually. So I was dealing with that while doing the podcast and all the other things happening in my life. And it was much worse for him than it was for me. So he's going to talk about that himself, and he should be the one talking about it. But I do want to share it because, as does he, because then we can fully understand the darkness to which all of us fell and how we all kind of got through it. He is doing so well now. He's doing so well, and I'm so very proud of him. Very proud of him. Having said that, just so you weren't wondering, when I kind of allude to it in the interview with Jeffrey, that's what we were talking about. And I don't talk about it because I get upset, as you just heard. But we're going to do it next week. Maybe next week. In the next couple of weeks. So here is my interview with Jeffrey Tucker. It's extraordinary, and do try to listen to the whole thing without stopping all the way through. Here we go. Hi, Jeffrey. How are you?
Good.
That's good. I'm so happy. And we got to meet recently, which was pretty fun. People are always better in person. And you were what I thought you would be like, only maybe better. It was sort of interesting, actually.
What do you mean by that?
Well,
tell me more.
Maybe, tell me more.
Tell me more about myself.
Maybe, I don't, it was, yeah, no, I guess it was, here's the thing. You cannot, as someone who spent my whole career interviewing people in person, mostly for documentaries. That dynamic can't really be replaced over digital interface in the sense. And I found you in the interview we did for a film, which is how we met, for people who don't know that, recently. I found you to be quite thoughtful and a bit more vulnerable about what the pandemic has done to us, which was really, really interesting because you're so thoughtful and at times almost academic about it. That was interesting to see you reviewing on a kind of a cellular level the damage. It was really interesting, right?
Well, writing is funny. We collect our sort of impressions of people, their voices, their characters, their personalities from their writing. But it's not always the same. Sometimes, because the thing about writing is that a good writer kind of, needs a completed thought before codifying it for print, for the final edition.
Yeah.
And it gives you the impression of, so good writers can sometimes seem more certain than they actually are and more complete than they really are. And so you don't see the process of thought in the writing because, watching a person, reading as a person's thinking, a stream of consciousness is quite boring, actually. So that means that writing tends to give a sort of distorted view of the personality behind the prose. I found that true.
Interesting. Well, and you said also that writers complete a thought and podcasters like me too.
Yeah, right.
I never complete a thought. I jump around and everybody knows everything. And it's quite interesting. But I love that. And the reason we're doing this is because my listeners love you. And I know that from many, many people I meet out in the world who are constantly thanking for people who were speaking out during the acute part of the crisis, although I think it's still acute, but it's more hidden. They always mention you. So I'm really glad that you were part of what we were doing here. And also now that we were friends and stuff, but you maybe you forget what it was like way back then, but your voice was so clear and you're so well spoken that you made a big, big difference for the people who listen to this show and for me too, personally. Well,
I'm so glad to hear it. I remember feeling very alone, but pretty sure, pretty certain of what I was saying, but also very confused that nobody. It was hard to find other people who would sort of affirm me or agree that there's fear in the air. There's fear and confusion mainly, and those are two things. I mean, I might have had fear, but my convictions, my intellectual convictions, overrode that. It's like, well, what else are we going to say when SWAT teams are breaking up bars in rural Texas and hairdressers are being arrested and pastors are being cuffed, for holding worship services, and parents are being harassed for arranging play dates for their kids. When you see this kind of stuff going on, then you understand the underlying rationale, which made no sense whatsoever. What are you going to do but say something about it? I mean, I was measuring the reality around me according to normal standards of what does liberty and justice and equality and rationality look like, And it was practically overnight. All of those standards just went away. We just replaced our normal sense of rationality with some foreign, strange, made-up, tyrannical dream of a virus-free world, and tried to make it happen. So, I found the whole thing just outrageous, and I couldn't help but just call it out every day, and I couldn't understand why more people weren't doing it.
Well, and you have the gift of being a good writer too, which helps. But one of the things, I don't know if you've written about this yet, but I'm sure you've pondered it, is why certain people, and even people outside of science, like myself, I never was afraid of the virus. I never had the fear. I figured out based on simply reading John Ioannidis's risk stratification chart,
Yep.
and understanding the the infection fatality rate, et cetera. Like those things are, you don't have to be Einstein. Seriously. Like it's basic critical thinking, right? Why do you think, beyond the scientific people who many of them knew that this was folly, why do you think some of us were afraid and bought into it, and others of us just kind of, like, I didn't have a minute of fear about dying from the virus. Not a minute. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, partially I think it's just because we were reading stuff, and also you might have had already a sort of foundation in understanding the human immune system, maybe, which I found to be generational. Actually, I'm sorry to put it that way, but I almost feel like sometime in the 21st century, there's this sort of lost body of knowledge concerning human immunology and its interactions with the pathogenic world. So I was never afraid, and I think you and I might have talked about this in Toronto during our interviews, but a big influence on my life was really, I'm sorry to say it, but it was the chickenpox party, and that led to a kind of counterintuitive realization for me that you need to get exposure in order to be protected. So let's just review here, because back in February, first of all, we heard about the virus in China in January, and we saw the lockdowns in Wuhan, which are very alarming. Throughout February, there was a lot of popular press that was laying out the likely IFRs. We had mainstream venues saying this could be a severe flu, but don't forget that prevalence and severity exist in a trade-off relationship to each other. There's no reason to panic about this virus. We know how to treat respiratory infections. And so I was really reading this stuff, but I saw there was a growing panic in the population throughout the month of February. So I kept writing articles highlighting what doctors were saying, what medical professionals were saying, what even the Yale Department of Public Health was saying, which was don't overreact, don't quarantine people arbitrarily. This is, don't use the presence of a virus as an excuse to violate people's rights. So I was kind of believing all this stuff, and then, as time went on, once you enter into March, we started getting ever more specificity concerning the age gradient of death. We had the case of the Diamond Princess, which confirmed everything. The average age of death was slightly above the average lifespan, with 2 or 3 comorbidities. All these things we knew before the lockdowns. But and here's what's fascinating to me about what we're learning from what happened with the lockdowns is actually remarkable. It was the prospect of lockdowns and the lockdowns themselves that generated a great deal of the public panic and the grim health outcomes. So a lot of people just freaked out, and thought they were getting sick, and just called the emergency rooms. And that's why the New York hospitals were overwhelmed. They are overwhelmed after the panic hit. The panic hit New York City on the 12th. And it was exactly that weekend when things started going crazy. And then it was that very following week when, several hospitals in several New York boroughs were overwhelmed. That was after lockdown. So when you hear Fauci now say, oh, we had to lock down because the hospitals were overwhelmed, well, that can't be true. The hospitals got overwhelmed after the lockdown decision was made on the 12th and 13th of March. And when after the fear of legal uncertainty and regime uncertainty and the upheaval of the prospect of universal quarantines, that sort of thing, struck the population, it threw everybody into panic and therefore ill health. And we saw this huge wave of death. More and more, it seems as if the wave of death in the spring of 2020 was inspired by the response, not the virus itself. And that is a remarkable observation. I know it's going to take a lot of proof and demonstration, but I can tell you Brownstone is on that case right now. I think we have all the evidence to prove it. In any case, you asked why it didn't affect me. It's because I had been expecting this for 15 years. I've been researching pathogenic worlds and immunology and the government response. I knew that there was a marginal junta out there in 2005 that believed in lockdowns, and I knew that they had gained ever more power. So I had been anticipating some response like this since about 2005 when I first wrote about the idea of using mass quarantines in the case of infectious disease. And I knew there was a kind of a biosecurity element out there, a sector of epidemiology that had kind of become enraptured with these modeling techniques and thinking that they could drive out a virus through state power. And now I have to tell you, when I first wrote about this on January 28th, 2020, I didn't actually believe they would do it. But I knew there was a threat that they could do it, and I knew that they could do it, right?
Yeah.
So I warned about it, and people at the time just thought I was bonkers. They're like, no, they're not going to close the schools, close the churches, shut the grocery stores. That'll never happen. And I said, look, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying that it could happen, and that there are plans out there, that there are people who believe this stuff, and we're seeing it now in China. So, let's not just rule it out completely. In any case, what we really need to do is eliminate the possibility that this kind of response to a respiratory infection could take place. So we need some serious legal reforms to eliminate this. So I was really writing as a way of sort of saying we need to rip out this machinery of the quarantine power in order to stop the temptation.
Yeah.
That was the idea. But I have to tell you, Trish, just full disclosure here. These days, people are frequently talking about how long it took them to calm down and realize that this should be handled through normal means and not through extreme means. And people have a date in mind. Sometimes it's the summer, it's the fall, it's the winter. Sometimes it's all the way halfway through 2021 or whatever. Sometimes it's just like last week,
Yeah.
But in my case, and so people have asked me this in the past, was there ever a moment when you did, slightly panic? And I have to tell you, there genuinely was. There was. And it lasted, and I'm super embarrassed about this, but it's good that it happened to me because it helps me kind of reconstruct things in my mind. But there were about 10 seconds there when I actually had this sort of sudden fear that there was a bad pathogen out there that was spreading through touching or being around people. And what happened was that I had gone to New York and with a friend. We were going to go to a couple of Broadway plays and hang out with friends, but the whole town had descended into sheer madness.
Yeah.
And I was trying to, hang around crowds so I could, sorry to admit, but I was trying to I wanted to get COVID, actually. I wanted to get it now so I could get the immunities and go back to normal life, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't worry about it at all. But then I went back to my place of work in Western Massachusetts with my friend, and I wanted to take him to the train station. And I said to somebody else, I said, hey, can you drop off my friend to the train station? And everybody was standing 10 feet away from me. And I thought, why am I having to yell at you across the hall? Is there something going on around here? And then, so I just come back from New York. And if you know the way, everybody becomes like weirdly provincial in these kind of cases. They always figure the virus is somewhere else. So people who come from somewhere else are probably carrying the bad thing that exists somewhere else, So
Yeah.
I had just come back from New York, so everybody kind of assumed I was infected or carrying it. And so people were standing far apart from me. And then I noticed that a lot of the staff there would not look at me. I actually did have a brief moment of panic, and it's so strange to reconstruct it in my mind. But I had gone to New York and met up with some friends. We were going to go to a Broadway play, but Broadway got canceled that day. They figured it's just for a few days and they'd be back. Of course, it was for 2 years.
Ugh, yeah.
New York, everybody was headed for the subways. People were drinking themselves to death in bars because they knew the bars were going to be closed. So people knew. And so the whole city was just in a frenzy. I was just trying to hang around crowds because in those days I thought, well, I'll just get COVID now and get immunities, and then I can be the guy who walks around taking care of the sick, because I'll be immune to it. So that was my fantasy. Well, anyway, I got on the train, got back with my friend to Western Massachusetts to my workplace and walked in. And I needed somebody to take him to the train station later that afternoon. In the intervening time, I noticed everybody was staying away from me. So I would ask somebody to take my friend to there, and they would not come any closer than like 10 feet. So I'm having to yell at people. And I'm wondering, why is everybody behaving so strangely? And then in the lunchroom, I thought, well, this is just silly. I'm just going to pretend that. I realized, it's only because I came back from New York. And in Western Massachusetts, everybody thinks they're clean people and New York is dirty. So I went to the dirty place. This is what happens when disease panic. They always think that the bug is elsewhere. Everybody else is dirty. You're clean. So the clean people, Western Massachusetts, didn't want to have anything to do with the dirty person who just came back from New York City. So I sat down at lunch and I deliberately sat in a far table away from everybody else. Just to kind of fake quarantine. I was kind of playing a game. But I noticed when people came into the lunchroom that they wouldn't look at me as if I was going to infect them with my eyes, So there was this whole kind of weird thing going on. Finally, I realized, I have to take back my friend to the train station myself because nobody else will. I thought, can you believe these people? You can just see what's going on here. So even at that moment, I was still dismissive and laughing in my head. But we drove all the way to the train station. We were talking about how strange the world was. And when we dropped him off, he said, well, it's been good to see you. And he stuck out his hand to shake it. And at that moment, I thought, had a brief moment when I thought, what if I get COVID from his hand? I was like, it was just a brief moment. And he was hilarious. He goes, hey, you don't have to worry about shaking my hand. Watch this. And he brings out a bottle of Purell out of his pocket and puts it on his hand. And I went, all right, now we got it going. So then we shook hands. And then I felt really embarrassed. And from my car on the way back, I called him. I said, I am so sorry, my friend. I don't know what happened. I'd had a slight temporary freak out there for a second, but so it did happen. There was, literally 5 to 10 seconds in which I got a little bit irrational about it.
No, but here's the thing. Like look, I am not saying that I am a perfect human being, but my levels of fear around it were like, I never thought I was going to die of it, but here's what I was worried about. I was worried because I had absorbed so much of the propaganda that if I got it, I might kill an old person, right? That's what I was afraid of. I was afraid that, because I live, you've been in my building. So it's a building full of kind of rich adjacent older people, right? And so I thought, wow, if I get it, what if I hit the button in the elevator and then one of the old people hits the same button, old Mrs. So-and-so up on the 6th floor, right? That's what I was worried about for a minute and a half. And the fear was obviously about passing something on that I would survive and they weren't, but it was, this is the truth. And especially after seeing the Kelly J. Keane video from Auckland, right? There is a connection here. That I was also terribly afraid of being the witch, the contagious witch who infected a town and everybody died, right? Who was it? Typhoid Mary or whatever?
Listen, that Typhoid Mary situation is a very interesting case because, here you had an Irish immigrant who was literally scapegoated for all the typhus in New York City, which had declined by 90% over the course of the century, but there was still a little bit left, and we tend to be most afraid of the things that's least troubling. So there were, several hundred carriers of typhus in New York at the time, but they demonized her and scapegoated her for all the infections, even though she tested negative again and again and again. And then they put her in isolation, mandatory isolation, told her that they had to take out her gallbladder. And she said, "I'm sorry, you're not taking out my gallbladder." And so after 10 years, they finally let her out on the condition that she not work for restaurants anymore. Well, she worked for a laundry, then she worked for this, and she worked for that. And finally she realized, gosh, what I'm really good at doing is serving food. So she went and served food again. They caught her and this time put her into solitary confinement for another 20 years before she died. So that was like one of the great evil tragedies. And that it was because of that incident, the complete rights violations of this poor woman, that quarantine powers were very much under suspicion by public health and mostly not used at all in the course of the 20th century because of cases like that. But her case illustrates what happens.
And you know how that translates, just sorry to interrupt, Jeffrey, but I had a thought, and when I feel like I need to act on it. But it is that if you translate that and bring it up into contemporary kind of woke culture, where there is a baying mob pointing at you if you do the wrong thing, then that really elevated the fear around being a person who misbehaved during COVID, right? It's like even worse now because of that particular dynamic within our culture.
You are so right about that. I have to say, I hadn't entirely thought about that. So it wasn't just that you were afraid of infecting others, is that you were afraid of being contact traced and therefore being considered a typhoid Mary or a disease spreader and scapegoated for everybody else's sickness, rightly or wrongly.
Absolutely. And that's why, like, I don't know where you sit on this, but since we're doing a kind of a COVID, this is like a kind of not an anniversary show, but sort of a memorial show. There was the debate for those of us who were enlightened about testing or not testing. And if you get sick with something that seems like maybe it could be COVID or flu or something, do you test, or do you not test? And the problem is if you do test and it's COVID, then a whole bunch of stuff happens. You've got to call the health department. You've got to tell everybody in your building. You've got to do all this stuff, right? And so there's a big moral debate around, do you test or not test, right? Like that's...
Well, what was the information we were supposed to get from that? You've got flu-like symptoms.
Yeah.
If it turns out to be COVID, then you do what? It was never clear what the point was for the individual.
Exactly.
Because they never gave us any protocols for how to get well, and in fact, what you would do for SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is pretty much what you would do for H1N1 or H5N1 or any other kind of respiratory infection like that. It's the same thing. You have to guard against secondary infections of a bacterial nature. You have to have plenty of water and rest and some vitamin D and zinc. And, we have other specialized drugs, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin are wonderful. And there's a few other things, but it's really no different from what you do to tend to a regular respiratory flu, which is exactly what doctors were saying in February. So really there wasn't from an individual point of view, any reason to test. From a public health point of view, they wanted you to test. Why? For this ridiculous idea that they're going to track and trace you, which is still going on to this day. I left Mexico City recently, and before I could board the plane, they wanted to have complete information about where I was headed and going, and the ostensible reason was track and trace. It's like, so if I get back to Connecticut and have COVID, then the public health they're going to call up, the taqueria in Mexico City.
I know, right? It's insane. It's insane. So I had a similar, these are the holdover stories, I guess. And let me just tell you that there are hospitals all over metropolitan Toronto. Toronto is one of the sickest. It's as bad as New Zealand and Australia, maybe worse for COVIDianness. It's terrible. And they don't want to give it up. And I'll give you a perfect example in a minute. But most of the hospitals in this city still have those plastic barriers up. If you go to Emerge, you're not sitting in a chair with your broken leg beside somebody you can commiserate with, right? You're sitting in like a plastic phone booth, a plexiglass. I know, and you know what happens to me, and this is my own weak kind of psyche, but when I see that kind of theater, I get enraged by it. You know, I want to go to the triage nurse and say, you guys are scaring everybody, stop it. But then I know I won't see a doctor for 3 hours, right? So, you know, you have to behave and kind of, you know, this is true. I have to go in for iron infusions. That's probably too much information at quite a good hospital here. And they'd reinstituted a mask mandate. And I walked in not knowing that. And this person, you got to put a mask on. And they came towards me and they put it in my hand and I put it on. I went down to the infusion place and the nurses there are lovely because they're always doing chemo on people. So they're really good people who care about their patients. And she said, gee, you seem upset. And I said, yeah. And she took my blood pressure. It was off the charts. And she said, well, I suspect your blood pressure is high because of what happened to you upstairs, like in the hospital, right? She said, I'll come back in half an hour. Half an hour later, I was fine again. So, right. So these things are so detrimental to us. They're so awful that I was centered out. People were staring at me like I was Typhoid Mary. You know, it's just ridiculous.
How many people died from the panic? Look, nothing like this has ever happened in our lifetimes.
No.
Or that of our parents or their parents or anything. Like, I don't know. What do you compare it to? Like Pearl Harbor? But Pearl Harbor is, you know, a long ways away. I mean, this was like happening in our own communities. The trauma that was brought about for the culture by these universal lockdowns it was unspeakable. And the fact that it sent people into a kind of a crisis of ill health and many people died as a result, that doesn't sound implausible to me at all. That it was not the virus that's somehow. So the other thing we know for sure, Trish, we know more and more that this virus had been circulating in the U.S. and Canada from October 2019. We know this now, you know. Yeah. So, and yes, it grew, and yes, it spread more and more as time went on. But you know, these viruses take time to kind of move through the population, depending on the so-called transmission rate or the so-called R naught. But we know for sure that it had been there. So October, November, December, January, February, March. So we're talking about 6 months of SARS-CoV-2 circulating very widely in the U.S. and Canada and all over the place, all coasts, everywhere. And nobody cared a thing about it. And then just overnight, all the governments, state, local, federal, everywhere, just start freaking out, shutting everything down. Everybody's running around with their hair on fire. And then, boom, we had mass death all over the countries. I mean, that's not it's very likely not the virus. It was the panic. Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've said this on the show, but I was not panicked about the virus. I was panicked about the panic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I could see like you used the Pearl Harbor analogy, but to make that a perfect analogy, it would be like Pearl Harbor if the naval base itself was complicit in its own bombing, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like all the institutions that are supposed to protect us from nonsense were complicit in the nonsense.
Yeah.
Right?
And you know what infuriated me at the time is that I hang out with this group of people called economists. And and they're just as silly as any other academics, fake intellectual academics. And they were generating all these papers in April and May and June going, well, there's not really. So one of the things economists do is they try to pretend as if all existing reality is a market response. I don't know if you know that about them, but they're funny people, right? So it doesn't matter what it is, you know. I mean, you could have the Aztec Empire slaughtering, virgins 1,000 a week, and they'll figure out some way to say it was a market. But anyway, so they're looking at the world. The business is shattered, everybody shut down. Nobody taking trips to restaurants closed, and they said, well, it looks to us as if it was a market response to a pandemic. And we know this because, look, we have data. So it's like, oh, give me data and I'll tell you all truth. And the data they showed was Google mobility statistics showing that everybody ran home and hid. And I wrote one of the main authors of this fake paper. And I said, I don't doubt your data. I have no doubt that people are running and hiding. But from the virus or from the anticipated government response to the virus?
Yeah.
And he was like, well, it's not really part of my model. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Either way, it's a market response. And so I said, look, it seems to me what you're saying is that lockdowns are perfectly normal way to respond to a pathogen. He goes, well, I'm just saying that the market did it, not government. It's like, okay, you're part of the problem, my friend.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's sort of interesting because there was a response. My response, I think we're different in some ways, but you're a more sophisticated person than I am, but in lots of ways, more cultured, I think. But my response was to move to Texas and get a Lincoln Navigator with a gun rack on the back. I mean, I really felt, which is completely actually antithetical to who I am as a human being. I drive a small car and don't have guns, but I did feel kind of like Waco, Texas-ish threatened by what they were doing. I felt like if they can do this and lie about it, or worse, be this goddamn stupid. Yeah. We are all at mortal risk of the people in the managerial class right now. And the thing was, Jeffrey, for me, there was no way out. The courts were not finding for the people. They were finding for the narrative, right? And I thought, so this is how it ends. This is it, right? This is why people become doomsday preppers and right? Dig a hole in the ground and fill it with spaghetti sauce and let's wait it out, right?
Oh, I went into such sadness for the first time in my life. I've always been the happiest guy. In second grade, they named me the squirrel because I was always singing all the time and whistling and making little happy sounds all the time. Yeah. And I've always been that way. I'm the happiest guy. God, you should have known me in the old days, Trish. You would have liked me. But
well, I like you now.
Well, thank you. But lockdowns changed my personality entirely.
Yeah,
and
me too.
But then it's a little bit, I'll tell you a quick story. One day, I lived through a hurricane and my house was pretty messed up and the tree fell out in the backyard and the electricity went out. And I was really sad about it. And then I went outside and realized, everybody else has it worse. And so I didn't feel as bad.
Yeah.
Well, that's what happened during COVID, because what happened to me was that I kept getting calls from my friends saying something's very wrong, which is another way of saying I'm about to kill myself.
Yeah.
So I realized that I had a job to do, which was to help people through this period, even if I was not entirely in great shape psychologically or otherwise.
Yeah.
I had a job to do as a writer, and so many people told me during those over the subsequent 2 years that my writings got them through the period, which is remarkable because I never set out to be a therapist. I wanted to be a reformer, not a therapist. But actually, that was the most good I've ever done for humanity was during those 2 years of writing basically every day about this, because it made people feel like maybe they weren't crazy. That's it.
Well, so so the therapy is not actual therapy. You're not sort of diagnosing from the DSM-5 or whatever it is, but what you are doing, and I think that you and I maybe inhabited a similar space on that, is that you are reflecting what people felt was their own reality, right? People who didn't buy into it were isolated and alone, and their family thought they were nuts, and they started thinking they were nuts. And then along comes, you and your old organization, and then Brownstone, saying all the things that really, I think, really smart, really sensitive, really dialed in people were thinking, and that nobody was reflecting back. So that in and of itself to me becomes a kind of therapy, right? That's what it is. Because otherwise you're living in cognitive dissonance, right? And that's really bad for us. So I think that's what you achieved. I'm not going to let you off the hook, because you said your personality changed because of COVID. You were saying you were a happy squirrel, and then your personality changed. So how has it changed?
I used to believe for a large part of my career that somehow the inevitability of freedom was baked into the structure of technology and was, presumed on the part of large parts of humanity. I'm a child of the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, I just thought it was going to be onwards and upwards forever. And it was my job to kind of chronicle it. I mean, if you look back at my past writings, I could wax eloquent for 5,000 words on the glory of chicken salad. I mean, I wrote about the silliest things you can possibly believe. I just thought the world was a place of magic, mystery, and beauty everywhere. And anybody who didn't see it wasn't opening their eyes. So my job was to open their eyes. So you imagine the difference in that worldview and what came to us in 2020. So I had to completely reconstruct my understanding of the trajectory of time, essentially.
Yeah.
In ways that probably people had to do at the onset of World War I. I didn't want to do it because it meant changing all my assumptions about how the world works and how I would respond to it. And my response was strange for me. I couldn't even follow it. One of the things that changed dramatically and overnight was, and this maybe sounds ridiculous to your listeners, but music is very important to me. And the music I listen to is sort of, I'm always giving myself a soundtrack to my life, based on my music preferences. And one of my favorite things that my whole life, ever since I was very young, was I loved the works of Gustav Mahler. And I used to listen to Mahler just all the time. I would take on a symphony a day and really take it apart and really listen to it. It's been the theme song of my life. After lockdowns happened, I couldn't even listen to it. I mean, it sounded like poison music to me. It just sounded dreary and awful and too... So the world of Mahler is a world of alternating between darkness and light and the transcendence and purgatory and time and filled with tragedy and filled with unrequited love and, just full of wild drama, which I had always otherized as an aesthetic, not a reality, Well, suddenly that Mahler world became the actual reality and I couldn't listen to it anymore because all it did was remind me of our terrible times.
Wow, that's so interesting.
And so what music I ended up listening to is so interesting. I spent 2 years listening to jazz from the interwar period, as superficial and silly and aspirational and happy as it possibly could be, which led to a general theory of mine about the relationship between reality and art. At least for me personally, I think maybe people like me want our art to be different from the reality outside of us. Not a perfect reflection of it, but a kind of an alternative universe that we can inhabit. And so the alternative universe I chose to inhabit was the world of Scott Joplin,
Right.
and happy music from the late teens and early 20s. And that was all I could really stand to hear.
Well, maybe because, as you say, the Mahler was completely encapsulating what you were experiencing in real life. Who wants a bunch of shit reflected back at you?
Yeah.
So here, it's funny that you said music because I am also a person who, if I ever get dementia, I'll be one of the people with dementia where if they play a song for me from 1963, I'll still know all the words. That's how my brain works, right? And I didn't know who Mahler was until I started watching Woody Allen movies. Right?
No.
So, so that's not, I didn't have much of a classical.
Oh, you're talking about that scene in Manhattan where they put Mahler in the Academy of the Overrated.
Well, but he was always talking about it, wasn't he? And I think in real life he was too, always talking about it. But that's not my thing. But I am a person who is deeply, deeply, deeply affected by music. Deeply affected by music. There's a piece of music, I think it's called On the Contemplation of Daylight or On the Something of Daylight by a modern composer. They used it in the film Arrival, and it's so incredibly beautiful. I can't listen to 30 seconds of it. I start sobbing. My kids think I'm insane, right? And so I have the same, and I wonder, it's a different, my husband is very visual and collects art. You saw the art, and he hates music. He doesn't care about it. I think, I think that part of our brain is maybe overdeveloped. And maybe that bespeaks in a way how we navigated through COVID in some way. That, I don't know. And now I don't listen to music now. That's my musical relationship with COVID.
Really?
I put it on in the car if I'm driving, but I don't have it in the house. I can't even believe I'm admitting this. I don't think I even knew this until you said that, but I kind of live in silence now unless I'm watching Escape to the Country on the BBC because I want to move.
Isn't that interesting? Really interesting. That is very interesting. Yeah, I can kind of see that. I can kind of see it. It doesn't come as easily to me as it once did. By the way, I eventually took up Mahler again. I started about a year ago, and it's been fun for me because I feel like, and now I listen to Mahler again, but I feel like maybe this listening that I'm doing with Mahler is my attempt to unite my understanding of reality with my musical imagination. I need a unity there that I didn't used to have. So I'm coming to terms with the new me. Yeah. And I didn't want, here's another very interesting thing, Trish, is that I had, previous to COVID, a professional reputation of being the happy libertarian anarchist optimist who always found the good in everything.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like why people read me. I mean, my books were called things like It's a Jetsons World, Bourbon for Breakfast, A Beautiful Anarchy, The Market Loves You. These are the titles of my books. So
very happy.
So it was like a professional risk and transformation for me. I had a fan base of people like, oh, Jeffrey's just such a happy guy. And then I had to become this sort of dark, brooding teller of tales of doom and woe. I mean, that was hard for me too, and people did cry. They're like, what happened to the old Jeffrey Tucker we used to know and love? It's like, well, he's gone. It's so bad, Trish. It's so bad. And it's just so pervasive, I mean, really, I still get calls. I got a call a couple of days ago from somebody I only know a little bit. And she called up. Well, she texted and she said, hey, can you talk? Which is always not a message you want. There's something about that. Hey, can you talk? Hey, do you have a moment? I mean, there's trouble. And sure enough, I get her on the phone and she just needed to talk. Her daughter's in trouble. Her son is lost and confused, addicted to digital media. Things are not going. The older son seems to be withdrawn and aimless. She's wondering about her life. What happens next is, it's just nothing in particular, but except just like shock and depression. All of it dating from the COVID response, all from the lockdowns, from the things, the shattering of the family, the arguments about vaccinations, from the quarantines and the travel restrictions, and the fact that you couldn't go to your grandmother's funeral and your kids lost 2 years of education, so on. So all these things add up. The scars are deep. It's not just scars; it's bleeding. And it's going on right now in so many lives. I swear to you. Every one of your listeners right now is suffering some pain. It's very deep. We're facing a massive cultural calamity. And one wonders where this ends up. I don't know, but it's whatever we observe in 5 years from now is going to be very different from the reality we lived 5 years ago.
I'm worried about, this is going to sound really morbid, but I'm worried about dying and leaving them with a world that is shit. Mm-hmm. And they've gone from thinking mom was insane for 3 years, embarrassed by, this crazy old anti-vaxxer, hag with a podcast who happens to be their mother. Now they've come around, especially the one studying science at uni, but who's really come around on this stuff, but they haven't come around on the tyranny part of it yet. They get that COVID was kind of a screw up. They understand that, but they don't understand how that happened and how we let it happen and why the media sucks and why our governance sucks, right? They haven't got that. I don't know if they have the tools to fight what may be coming for them right now or in the future.
Well, it's certainly going to make us stronger. One of the things that it's because, my God knows I went through my dark moments. No reason to go into it, but somebody said to me at that time, they said, we all have existential thoughts, like even suicide ideation at our darkest moments. The problem with acting on them is that it prevents you from the exercise of courage of getting through the dark moments and then enjoying the light that comes at the end of the dark.
Right.
So despair now and acting on that despair is a catastrophic decision. It's actually irrational, because if you work through it and fight, and this is where faith comes into it, right? I mean, the person told me that this is in God's hands, really, and God has given you the means to get through this period and then present to you a new way of living that will be successful and self-affirming, and you'll be able to rebuild, but you won't be able to rebuild if you act on your despair. So that was very persuasive to me, and it turned out to be true. Look at, now I've got Brownstone's thriving. We're helping a lot of people. I've got 9 fellows who are putting out great material. I'm in the demand as a writer. Things are going well for me, really, by any standard. Well, I would have missed all that if I'd acted on it. So I have shared that same message to so many people who have called me up and said, I'm in a very dark place. And I think I know what that means now. And I share that same thing, that the dark night of the soul is sort of baked into the trajectory of our lives so that we can find our way out of it towards the light. That's the intention. That's the purpose of the darkness, is to inspire within us a creativity which we otherwise would not have had, to find our way out. St. John of the Cross uses an example of going into a new city or a new town without a map, and your senses have to be newly aware. You can't just sort of wander around. You have to use every clue, figure it out, seek the help of others. And that journey itself gives you tools, information, and a more robust sort of character that stress feeds our personalities in ways that make us better people in the end. Without having been lost, we never would have developed those specialized skills. So if you want to speak about it in philosophical terms, that's the purpose of the dark night of the soul, is to help us become better, stronger people.
Yeah, and we, in AA, we do have a great phrase about suicide, which is that it is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, right?
Okay, yeah, that's a much better way of putting it.
Not as eloquent as you,
or as long-winded.
yeah, but both things are true. I didn't were you that dark at times during? Yeah. Oh, yeah. You hit it well, friend. I must say, I was too. I mean, I think my listener sort of knew something was up, because I didn't want to be kind of a Debbie Downer constantly, but podcasting is such an intimate medium that I think people knew, and I would say I'm feeling kind of down. But here's what I know about COVID and suicidal ideation and trouble. I know literally no one who died of COVID. I know 3 people who relapsed seriously on really scary drugs. And I know on the periphery of my life, a man who went out to the barn and put a shotgun to his head, right? So during COVID, who was also an addict. So this is one thing for me as part of the kind of addict community. These are my people. I'm proud of them. I think people who in recovery are some of the most enlightened, spiritual, smart, brave, cool people in the world, right? I believe that, and I see it. I see guys come in who were literally bums, who were homeless, urine-soaked bums on the street who'd been former lawyers of some repute, just ruined by alcohol, kind of holding the little card you read at the AA meeting in a shaking hand, which is it's like the ultimate, kind of depiction of hope of the human spirit, right? And then a year later, they're sparkling clean and shiny and happy people. So I believe in all that stuff. And I think that we have not talked enough about what closing down AA and then doing mask only and then vax mandates. And you know what? I'll say this, just one thing. The AA international service, world service, as it's called in New York, the head office of this magnificent program that's been saving lives for 50 or 60 years, didn't take a stand as many churches didn't. And this was, I'm also a Catholic who became a Catholic late in life. None of the infrastructures that were going to keep me sane and from thinking about suicide existed. There were Zoom meetings. I don't think you can do things on Zoom meetings. It doesn't work for me, right? So that was also a really big moment of, wow, when things go south, they go south for all the stuff we need in life, right?
Yeah, I had a friend. So I didn't really understand anything about AA. Actually, what am I talking about? It's also called a Jeffrey Tucker dinner party. No.
Why? Because your friends drink too much, or because they don't drink? Which is it?
We just talk about cocktails all night, and we're the same thing as an AA meeting. You know? So,
yeah, right.
Yes. But I had a friend of mine, and it's funny because his whole thing in life is he became, I guess, an alcoholic, and with that comes other drugs. And God knows, I don't know anything about that stuff, So my drug of choice is chewing tobacco. But when COVID came, for him anyway, the weekly AA meetings were his kind of faith community. So it's very interesting. Like, I don't really understand this world, but he would go. He hadn't drank for, I don't know, like 5 years or something like that. But his whole social circle was a bunch of people hung around who don't drink, and they would meet up every week and talk about the days when they drank and how glad they're not drinking. I don't know what they talk about at AA. But in any case, when COVID hit, in the name of public health, they shut down all the AA meetings.
Yeah.
Well, they kind of tried to go to Zoom or whatever. It didn't work.
No, it doesn't work.
And so of course, he turned back to all the hardest stuff, right? Just like within a month, lost his mind, lost his job, and is now languishing, suffering, and God knows where. So, yeah.
I've got one of those too. I've got a guy, lovely young guy, of quite a famous, not famous, but moderately well-known, but excellent writer who relapsed and was on a vent for a month, and now he may be lost. People see him on the street, in that way you do when somebody's kind of using.
So many tragedies, big and small, aren't there?
Makes me so mad.
And it's funny too, the way this conversation has gone, because I think we always have the intention to talk about the particulars of the his history here and how it all unfolded in a legal legislative policy sense, which about which I'm a real master of detail here, but also you were a very sort of honest, true blue podcast in the sense that you want to really talk about what matters. And here we are talking about the psychological impact and the impact on community life and family life from the policy response. And I think in the end, that is a much more important topic.
Well, it's everybody that I know says that something has shifted. We're all different. And people also say, when you're talking about whatever this kind of tyrannical thing is, that it's already happened. I was like, it's a terrible thing. Remember Naomi Wolf was, when she was on Tucker the first time, like 2 years ago, and she here's this lefty feminist who went on Tucker, to say, look, the world is collapsing. Right? Tyranny is coming. And now I hear from really sure it's here. Like they're not going to turn back. This sounds really paranoid, but bank bank branches in my neighborhood are closing down. Bank branches in my neighborhood don't keep cash anymore.
Right.
You know, they want this digital thing. I'm like, you know, not to be too Klaus Schwabian about it, but those things also really scare me, because what they showed us with the COVID clampdown is that they can do whatever the hell they want because they're controlling the media, the media is, right.
And so it doesn't matter. Yeah. There have been some courts that said, oh, you can't do that to renters. Oh, you can't do that. You know, okay, fine. But it's just been a very marginal response. The big picture is that the ruling class takes away from this experience that they have the complete ability to do whatever they want. My old friend named Sam Francis, who's a political philosopher, and I didn't like anything he had to say. And I reject he had a very dark worldview, but he used to say that we were headed to a world of what he called anarcho-tyranny. Now, that sounds like a contradiction, because anarchy means no government, tyranny means only government. But what he meant was that we'd be ruled by a state that itself would obey no laws at all, and that it would just be completely arbitrary. It would just be a kind of a destruction of all these core tenets that we expect in the West, of the rule of law, custom, and that this would gradually break down the culture and acculturate people to, compliance with arbitrary dictate above all else. And that trajectory has not been changed. I mean, just yesterday, the U.S. Congress repealed the emergency declarations that were declared in March of 2020, but it does nothing. It just eliminates one cosmetic feature, but the underlying reality is this sort of arbitrary rule by these oligarchs. And it's no longer obvious to me, like, who or what is doing it, since we've got this amalgam of media, tech, and government, all kind of, and farm, and, the biomedical security state and everything, all kind of marching in lockstep. All is this big blob that's sucking the wealth away from the poor and the middle classes and going to them. They're accumulating ever more resources and ever more power. And that is going on before our eyes right now, and nobody knows what to do about it.
And what's really terrifying, everything you just said is, in my view, exactly right. And if you layer on top of that the absolute cruelty and inhumanity around what the COVID policy did. I hate it when people say, oh, that, there's suicides because of the pandemic. No, there isn't. There's suicides because of pandemic policy. Those are policy deaths, and I won't call them anything but that, right? So if you layer what you just said, which is this amalgam of powerful forces, with what we were shown during COVID about how cruel they can be to us, right? Then you've got a real problem. These are not kind of, it's not an authority that even has a kind of noblesse oblige about us. They just hate us, right? And we're all sacrificial. That's my feeling about the vaccines, even, that I think that they kind of knew they weren't safe and effective. But, if we have to sacrifice some kids, if we have to sacrifice, that's fine, because that's kind of what we're doing, right? There's an element of that in the things that they decide, I think.
No, if you understand the Joker in Batman, you understand the regime that's ruling us today.
Do explain what you mean by
that. Well, the Joker just wanted to create chaos, and he was nihilistic and just was entertained by the use of his own power and by the resulting chaos. And he was amused by the responses of people below him and loved just tearing things down. An ideology which you could call destructionism. All it leaves in its wake is his own personal awesomeness and his power. And that sort of attitude is what we're seeing now from the ruling classes, oligarchs that are running the world. They know that even if their plans don't work, and none of them did, they're more powerful than ever before. And they've set precedents that nobody seems to know how to get rid of. And they've destroyed people's expectations about how life is supposed to work and replaced it with a kind of a compliance to people going along with whatever the hell happens just under the assumption that the world is nihilistic. People have stopped believing in meaning in life.
Yes.
And they don't know why they're here. I mean, I literally had somebody ask me this question a couple weeks ago. Why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? How come I get up every day? Is it just to do things that cause money to flow into my bank account so I can pay for pasta and cell phones, and then I do it again the next day? I mean, where is all this leading? What is my purpose? Wow, what a question, huh?
What'd you say?
I quoted. By the way, I'm not. I don't want to parade around as like some sort of paragon of religious piety, which I am not. I'm not even particularly religious, but I said, well, the old Catholic Catechism says the purpose of your life is to glorify God and serve Him forever.
Yeah. And I will say, and I've said this before in the show, but I'll say it again for people who are waiting for something to really latch on to. I think Jeffrey's right. And I will say this to Jeffrey, that when my world blew up in 1999, and it really blew up, and it's when I quit drinking, but I had a multitude. I was fighting battles on every front in my life. I was a single mother. I just had a baby. My career was blown up. I was being sued by 2 people. I was on the witness stand being abused. The media was picking on me, and it was all kind of bullshit. But because I wasn't a very nice person, there weren't a lot of people riding to my rescue. So I'll just say that. Although I will say 2 years ago, one of the lawyers took me to lunch at a very expensive restaurant and apologized for what he'd done and said he was wrong. So that's cool. But so I was left with nothing. I had no money, a kid, my life was over. So what did I do with that? I quit drinking. So that was good. But what I learned from that, and maybe this is a lesson for everybody or for some people, is that I had to make my life really small to rebuild. So I stopped reading decorating magazines. I stopped reading Vogue. I stopped coveting. I devoted myself to my children, which it sounds really anti-feminist. Please don't think that, but I did. I made living in service to my children the number one priority in my life, right? And I bought cheap food at the Chinese market at the end of my street and didn't hang with the cool rich people anymore. And it was the happiest I ever was. And that is absolutely no lie. So I had to find my value on the inside of me instead of living like a kind of a rich yuppie on the outside when I was a big TV star. And it changed me permanently. And I'm trying to get back there now. And I'm finding it really, really, really hard.
As you talk, Tricia, it makes me suddenly realize something really important. And I have to say that I was part of the problem in this respect. When the digital age came along, we had Facebook, and then we had Instagram, and then we had MySpaces, and we had, all these things started happening to us. We thought we had a new path towards friendship, value, a new way to be valued as individuals. Because my God, my birthday comes and Mark Zuckerberg reminds all my friends on Facebook it's my birthday, and they all write me and say happy birthday to you. And my God, I got 350 of those. I've never had such a great birthday. People love me, and I love them. And here's my picture of me with a happy face on, and so on. And this is for 20 years. This is how people learned to live life, thinking that this is the good life. 20
years, I know, right?
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And then emails, and we all throw ourselves into the digital world. And we've got a new way to live. We've got a new way to do friendship. We've got a new way to value others and to be valued ourselves. That was never possible for people. But you know what? This is the thing. When it turned out that all these venues we were using were just stalking forces for surveillance and state power, that ended up locking us down, shutting our churches, closing our schools, closing our AA meetings, and limiting our house parties and not allowing us to go to our grandmother's funerals, we were betrayed. We were betrayed by the thing for 20 years we believe was going to save us. Incredible.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And
Trish.
what are we left with? What are we left with? Because it was proved ultimately unsatisfying. We had dismantled our connection to our local communities already over the course of 20 years. We neglected our families, our communities, our churches, our civic obligations to others, our local art scenes, and so on. And instead gave our money to Netflix, got our birthday wishes through Facebook, and shared our experiences with random billions of individuals on Instagram, and our professional achievements on LinkedIn. And when all of those proved unsatisfactory, we didn't have anything to fall back on.
Yeah.
It was just us alone in our rooms, and they told us we were doing the right thing.
Yeah. That is very profound. I think you have completely nailed it there. Because the other aspect of communal living and culture and society is also serving each other, like in the biblical sense, that you serve. But that's what they teach us in AA too. We stay sober by rescuing other alcoholics, right? And part of what I did in that period of my life, besides getting sober, I worked, and I'm not bragging, I'm talking about this as remedial rather than virtuous, that I worked at the Out of the Cold program in my church basement. So we'd bring the homeless people in and feed them and put them to bed. And it was the most fun I ever had. And that's actually what nurtures us. It's what feeds us. And we're not taught that anymore. And our kids are not taught that anymore. And they certainly don't want us doing that.
No. The whole thing is ridiculous, actually. By the way, you just do need to appreciate how completely different this messaging I'm giving you today is from what I would have said, 10, 15 years ago, or even 5 years ago. But, your Facebook friends aren't going to bring you meals if you're sick. Who's going to care for you when your brother commits suicide and you're devastated? When your child dies? When your wife leaves you? Where's your community? Where's your community of support? Who's the person who's going to come over to your house and bring you the prescription drugs that you need that your pharmacy won't give you because the FDA has said they can't distribute it? We have to rely on others and their physical presence, and that means building a community, which is the purpose of civic organizations. And I don't care if it's AA or the local Baptist church. I don't even care what your theology is. You have to have a community. I have to tell a funny story. So I live right across the street from a great grocery store called Rasham that serves a kind of a wide variety of community of, I would just put it as a community of others. So it's owned by a Muslim family, but there's plenty of Hindus that work there, but they serve Christians from that sort of what you think is, a region of the world where that's not the West, And I've been so impressed at the sheer communityness of that enterprise.
Yeah.
And I'm always joking with there's a kid there that I love so much. He's just hilarious. And I was always telling him that I'm thinking about converting to Islam. And he said, well, you're doing a good job. Because, when I stop drinking for a time or something, I'm thinking, I'm really thinking about converting to Islam because I'm getting the whole alcohol thing solved. He says, that's great. Well, we'll get you a magic carpet and you'll be on your way. And so yesterday, it's Ramadan right now. Yesterday I went in and I said, look, I've got a big meal planned and I'm going to eat it before sundown. I can't do this Ramadan thing. And I'm looking more and more at Hinduism. And he laughed and he goes, well, that's a respectable religion, It's just a funny remark. We need a faith and we need a faith community. And I don't know. It seems, Trish, that we need much more than just an ideology to keep our lives together. We need more than that. We need much more than that. We need a community. We need a belief system. We need a purpose. We need meaning in our lives. And meaning doesn't come from abstract ideology. It comes from connection to others. And that's what they targeted. That's what they shut down, intentionally or not.
That is really smart because what brought Canadians together were the truckers, right? It was Tamara Leach and Chris Barber and the rest of them. And the reason we were joyful, they did a big demo just a block from my apartment, and I couldn't even believe the joyfulness of it and the hugging and the actual kind of Canadianness of it was so antithetical to what was happening elsewhere. And then, of course, they did so well in Ottawa, and our prime minister, who is part of this kind of global cabal, him in particular, because he's not bright, he's not a bright guy, totally captured. And when he put down the trucker movement with the Emergencies Act, he was putting down a kind of a burbling up of what you just talked about, right? That we were coming together. We were happy in each other's companies. We felt we weren't alone. We were talking about how fellowship was more important even than staying alive. Like I know old people who said, I would much rather have taken a risk with the virus than been locked down like a criminal in long-term care, right? All those things were being talked about with this wonderful trucker energy. And of course, they had to just, put the kind of jackboot of tyranny on the necks of that movement. And all of the kind of hideous, politically driven kind of deep staters in Ottawa managed to get a report from the commission saying, oh yeah, nothing, it was okay. He did the right thing, sort of. Even though there's no evidence in what they found in the report to even justify for a second the Emergencies Act. Nothing. All the security people said, yeah, nothing, there was nothing bad happening, no security risk, and all the crimes they were accused of, that didn't happen. All of it, including the information that Chrystia Freeland used to freeze bank accounts. All of it was by evidence blown up during the very hearings that said that our prime minister did nothing wrong. So there you go. Truckers, that's why they were the fellowship.
Isn't it remarkable? And what we've seen, who saved us from utter doom? It wasn't the intellectuals.
Nope.
And it wasn't our elected leaders so much, and it certainly wasn't the permanent bureaucracies or the tech companies or the media people that we used to trust. It was the community relationships that people have.
Yeah.
And quite often, the working classes, I'm sorry to put it that way, it sounds like I'm otherizing them in some way, but working classes and also the coherent, well-organized communities of faith, the Hasidim and the Amish and the Mormons and all these groups that are sort of marginal to what we call the mainstream of life, were the ones who showed themselves bold and brave enough to defend basic human values over the last several years. We have to learn something from that.
Yeah. Well, the Pope was not great. I'm sorry.
He was awful. He was absolutely awful. And
now he wants to get rid of Latin Mass, which kind of bugs me.
Of course, yeah. No,
Latin Mass is like opera for me. Like, I don't really get it, but I'm glad it exists because I think it makes the world a better place.
Well, can you imagine being around in 1965 when that whole movement towards vernacular liturgy first began and what that did to people's faith? And what we see from the empirical data is that people stopped going to church.
Yeah.
When the altars were turned around, the high altar that your ancestors had built, suddenly became a card table in the middle. Whether that was right or wrong, it was deeply disruptive to people's liturgical expectations, and shattered their faith in some way. And they said, well, the people in charge don't seem to care. Why should I care? And the church is, emptied out, relatively speaking, after the liturgical changes of the mid-1960s. So often in my own mind, this is the first time I'm actually saying it, I've analogized lockdowns to that. So our lives are full of liturgical impulses, there's stores we go to, meetings we attend, funerals we go to, there's streets we drive on, trips we take, visit grandmother in the nursing home. We go to work, for God's sake, We drive to work and hang out with others. Then we get off work at 5, and then we have dinner by going to all the sort of things we took for granted. Just overnight, they said, no, you can't do any of that stuff anymore. So what happened to the Catholic communities after the Second Vatican Council, when suddenly the nuns had to put on pantsuits and take off their, And so all that disruption shattered the Catholic Church, and it hasn't recovered. It hasn't recovered since. But that's just a small community and a small sector of life, namely religious practice. Now, you expand that model to the whole of society, to everybody of all faiths, to every walk of life, and suddenly we're all just rats. And there's a grand science experiment. What does that do? What does that do to people's willingness to participate in social life, to our expectations about the future, to that hope that comes with just being alive? What does that do? That shatters everything. If I'm right about this, we're not going to recover in a year or 5 or 10. It's going to be generations of rebuilding.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's true. And I was actually thinking before this interview about all of the wonderful people that I've met on this during this time. I was going to say on this journey, and I hate that expression so much. I'm stopping myself and rewriting in my head. But over the last 3 years, and one of the things I hope happens, given the struggle of the real, the Jay Bhattacharya and Scott. I mean, I know what Scott went through, and well, you know better than I do, but the professional shunning and the humiliation, and I mean, it's just awful. And I hope that in 20 years, historians will say something like there was a time when this miraculous bunch of courageous people, kind of like the French underground, stood up and said the right things. And I hope they're named and that statues are built, for them. I feel that. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but I want you to respond to that.
We all worry what the history is going to say. And we imagine ourselves 25 years hence and wonder what the history is going to say. But what I've come to realize is that this history doesn't happen as if on some sort of Hegelian autopilot. I think we need to write the history now, and we need to write that history every single day for the next 25 years. If we want the history to read as you think it should, then we need to tell that story.
Yeah. I'm going to read you something. There is a place in Toronto which had some of the most draconian lockdowns and it was insane here. And I'm sure drove many people to do desperate things. And one of the people driving that public health was a woman named Eileen de Villa, comically called Cruella de Vil by people.
Of course. I mean, that's the first thing that occurred to me.
It writes itself, right? So there is now in a glass box, as if it is a kind of totem to heroism, one of the scarves she wore at news conferences as she was announcing all of the things that would destroy our city. I'm going to read what the little card says with the display. We were introduced to Canada's medical officers of health when they became the public faces of the COVID-19 fight. More than half of those leaders, 12, are women, including the notable Dr. Eileen de Villa, medical officer of health for the City of Toronto. Dr. de Villa's transparency, directness, and advocacy earned her the trust and the title as the people's doctor. Not this person. At every briefing, Dr. de Villa wore a scarf which quickly became her signature at Toronto City Hall on March 19th of 2020. Dr. de Villa wore this scarf with brown stripes and green zigzags. Dr. de Villa not only receives scarves as tokens of appreciation from Torontonians, she also offers them as symbols of warmth and protection for community members, mentees, and public officials. So Dr. de Villa's scarf sits in the Toronto History Museum Artifact Collection. We're not building monuments to the people who did this, but we're putting their articles of clothing in glass boxes for the rest of us to worship at. So does that tell you anything about if these people are ever going to admit it and apologize? I don't think so.
That's so creepy about the scarf, because another scarf lady was Deborah Birx in the United States. I wonder if some memo went out, I don't know. It's so creepy.
But it's you know what it is? It's really interesting you would say that, because you're a guy with pretty elevated taste, and I like to think I am too, although I usually only wear black, but that's tasteful. But there is also a certain type of woman who wears a scarf. Most women don't wear scarves like that, right? Certainly hip, intellectual women don't wear scarves like that. They're seen as kind of old lady-ish, a little hall monitory-ish, right?
Interesting.
So maybe that's who's attracted into public health.
It's funny that after Deborah Birx resigned and just became a sort of a public intellectual, suddenly the hair was down and the scarf was off. So, what happened?
Yeah, I know. It's funny, right? It's funny. I know.
Very interesting theory.
Yeah, very interesting.
No, they're trying to write the history that they're valorizing themselves. Or actually, what I'm seeing more and more of is
that's a good word, valorizing. I like that.
More and more, they're just trying to pretend like the whole thing didn't happen. Which is why brownstone drives people crazy, because like every single day, this is basically all we talk about, right? Yeah. And they want it gone. They want it just shut off. And not just the people who did this to us, but the many people who should have spoken out but didn't. They want it gone too. And the people who are just flat out wrong and said, well, I think lockdowns are great, they want it gone also. So everybody kind of wants to, wipe this under the carpet.
It's so important. Brownstone is so important. But here's the other interesting thing that I'm going to start focusing on a bit in my Substack. Mark Crispin Miller is doing this kind of died suddenly Substack that I think is probable. I don't think everybody who dies suddenly had a vaccine injury. Obviously, it's a ludicrous idea, but he's making a point, right? And in Canada right now, and I think in America too, the random murderous violence is off the charts. I mean, we had an 18-year-old, 17-year-old kid stabbed in the subway last week to death by the city. And this is happening over. A friend of mine from CBC was killed 3 weeks ago on the street in a really good neighborhood by a nut who and I feel like saying, what did you think the mental health crisis was going to look like? It isn't just people killing themselves. It's people killing other people. So all of these huge things are happening statistically. The numbers are going off the charts, and nobody's connecting it to COVID-19 policy. No one is talking, right? They're not talking about it that way. So it's not clocking in. Right? They don't have to take responsibility for something they're not acknowledging. It's just like, wow, why is everything so nuts right now? How did that happen?
Yeah. What did you think a mental health crisis was going to look like? Was it just going to be people sitting at home sort of sad? Or was all your expectations of the way culture is supposed to work going to be shattered? The sexual, gender dysphoria that you have that's just been unleashed during the pandemic is just one sign of that, right? Once people got away from their peers and normal function of social life, I mean, basic facts of biology are suddenly under question, so.
Because of TikTok, exposure to TikTok, I think, right?
I despise that app. I just despise that app. I really don't think it should be banned. I think that would be a terrible thing, but I just wish people would stop using it. In fact, I've kind of turned against all that stuff, really. I mean, there's a purpose of technology, but it's not to substitute for life itself.
No, and it's hard to pull away from. And I am on Twitter still because I need it to promote the podcast. But I also feel the tug. I feel that, what's happened in my notifications this morning? And I'm like, what are you doing? Oh,
I know. I've turned off all my notifications. And, there's other things I've done that have really improved my life. And this is just kind of slightly goofy and it probably doesn't mean anything. But I finally had a 0.5% sort of thing in my brain that my Google Home was spying on me. And I kept thinking about it. It's like, well, it's not really spying on me. It only spies on me when I say, when I get its attention. Well, wait a minute.
When you say John Brennan really loudly or something, right?
Yeah, right. But wait a minute, it has to be listening all the time to find out if I'm calling it to service, by saying, "Hey Google," or something like that. So finally, I was bugged by this enough that I finally collected every Google Home. But that's a tool I used to love, and I finally collected them all and threw them in the trash. And I tell you what, I had the most happy sense after that. And so now I just, I got an iPad and I plug it into a speaker and go over and click my Spotify and say, play Scott Joplin or whatever, play Brahms.
Yeah.
So what? I have to walk 4 feet over to change the music selection. So the flip what? So I have to turn on lights now. I have to adjust the thermostat, by standing up and walking over to. Is that such a huge price to pay? I have to say, getting rid of my Google Homes, you could say I'm crazy. They dramatically improved my life. I'm just thrilled. Now I feel like I don't have a state spy bug that I voluntarily stuck in my home. I remember when they were giving those things away. Hey, you've earned a free Google Home. I was like, okay.
It's a Trojan horse. Right? It's the Palo Alto Trojan horse. But well, that's interesting. I'm actually surprised that you were a guy sitting there like George Jetson in your chair, barking orders at your house, right? But it really surprises me, Jeffrey.
It does. So you didn't know the old me. I was that guy. I wrote a book called "It's a Jetsons World." So I mean,
you did?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so funny.
That's the name of the book.
I didn't know.
It's a Jetsons World. Yeah. So no, I was all into all that stuff. I just thought they were giving rise to a perfect life. I had this ridiculous theory that we were going to migrate out of the physical world into this digital world where the state can't touch, therefore be free forever. It was like metaverse crap. I look back at that. It's like, where did I go wrong? Well, someday I'll write my whole retrospective, although nobody cares.
Everybody cares. But that's interesting because I saw this the other night. Apparently some of the tech titans like Elon and others, I think there are others, are saying AI is a problem, right? AI is going to be a problem. And like stupid me, I'm not that smart, but I was talking about being governed. Our world is now governed by tech titans who are probably guys who are socially not that smart. They were in their basements. All these guys are not guys I want running policy around being human beings. They're like the least human of the human beings. And yet that's what they're doing. And they're in control of this really powerful thing. And I did a show where the premise was, shouldn't we be like calling in the priests and the philosophers and the smart people to have a big powwow about how far we want AI to go before we unleash it on the world? Like that's not, you don't have to be Einstein, right? And now they're finally saying it. We think it's gone too far. It's pretty darn dangerous and people should be allowed to have jobs and not be replaced, even if it means working at McDonald's. Like, yeah. Why are they only saying that now? Maybe because the horse is out of the barn and they know they can't stop it. I don't know. But
yeah, I don't know.
Right. But let me just say something too about what you said about your Google Home, and kind of ordering it to do stuff for you. That it made me think of the work from home crowd, right? Where these things that are convenient are actually not good for us. I think it's probably good for us to turn on our lights and look for our Spotify. The same way I think the routine of going to work in the morning, getting up and putting on some lipstick and getting dressed and taking the bus or whatever to go to a place where you congregate with other workers is good for us. It seems inconvenient, but it's actually good for us, right? So I don't think these things that make our life easier, in air quotes, actually are things we should be doing.
No, it's not good for us. It's terrible for us. We need sunlight. We need exercise. We need to be volitional beings, not just people who run technology. It's ridiculous. I mean, what kind of person just sits in a chair all day and just orders technology to do things for you? It's the kind of person that can live off bugs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what that's what they want to do to us. And so if you don't want to live off bugs, you need to start changing your life. That's my view. You just have to start changing your life, get a spark and an activity. Yeah. And I've fallen in love with all the old technologies. I really have. I mean, I don't like all the fancy pants, digital modern stuff anymore. I mean, I have no interest in it whatsoever. I was betrayed. I mean, they betrayed me. These bastards made me look like a fool. Like my literary legacy is in flames as a result of what happened in 2020.
But who would have thought? I mean, no one predicted this. I mean, except for Alex Jones, and look where he is now. But
I know. But my book called Beautiful Anarchy is my single most absurd book. I think I hate even going back. And the prose is great. It's very compelling. It's in 5 languages.
Wow.
But I think it's all incorrect now, and it infuriates me actually. But the other thing is, I think my biggest mistake was optimism. So G.K. Chesterton used to say that optimism and pessimism are both grave errors and both equally dangerous. One leads to excessive hope, the other to excessive despair. Whereas really, we just need to be realistic and realize that we can control what we can control, and that the history doesn't have a predetermined path, at least one that we can understand. So I think I just became sort of guilty of that sort of optimism. It made me blind to realities that were all around me. This happened to the liberal intellectuals of the 1880s and 1890s, right? So you had terrible things happening, but they didn't want to see it or believe it. And next thing you know, we got World War I, so I was, and I knew about that history, and I knew about the mistakes they made, but I didn't believe that it would apply to myself. I imposed upon myself a certain model of the way the world was supposed to work, and just kept finding evidence to confirm it.
But I know that, but that's human nature. But we also don't, when we're living our lives, perceive ourselves as actors in an historical time, right? It's only historical when we look back on it. So, right, you don't say, "Oh, I'm doing what they were doing in the 1920s." Like you don't live your life that way.
You're right. The culture of our times is invisible to us. It's really true.
Yeah, and also but the other thing you just said, which is really smart, amongst many smart things you've said, is that like one of the things they teach us to keep us sober is acceptance. Right. So the idea that you should neither be super optimistic or super negative because shit is just going to happen it's actually a very Buddhist position. And what one prays for and what they teach us to pray for is not that stuff doesn't happen because it's going to happen, but that if stuff happens, God gives us the strength to deal with what it is. So that's why we don't fear the world. We don't fear the world, not because there isn't awful things, children die, tyrants happen, etc. But what keeps us moving and centered is the idea that when those things happen, we'll be given the strength to cope with whatever it is, right?
Yeah, I suppose that's right. Yeah, we definitely, and if nothing else, the last 3 years have made us smarter, more realistic, and hopefully, if we all get through it, stronger and better people. Now, that's not to say I think is a welcome development. I would much rather this be 2019, honestly. And yet, it's not. It's not. No. And we have to believe that we're here for a reason. And the way I've consoled myself is with the belief that I have a mission. Just like you said in AA, that they tell you that the reason you're there is to help other alcoholics. Yeah. So I've come to believe that the reason I write is provide a clear and honest and truthful as I can account of the world around us in hopes of inspiring at the margin some improvement. When I say at the margin, I really do mean it. I mean, it's like, I think often of what it must have been like to be in Berlin or Vienna in 1938, and you realize the calamity is all around you and there's nothing you can do to stop the trains from moving and the camps from operating and the map of Europe turning black. But you do hear a knock at the back door and there's one person looking for refuge. You've got an attic, you've got a basement. Okay? Yeah. What do you do? Yeah. Yeah. You save what you can. You save what you can. And in so doing, you're doing the right thing and you're doing all that you can do. You have to do it and you have to believe that it's enough. It's enough to do what you can do.
Yeah. That's really well said. Ann Bauer said that on my show about a year and a half ago. She said, she's Jewish, and she said, as she was opining about the snitching and the shunning and the horrors that were going on in Minneapolis, where she was from, as a former lefty who's now kind of reformed on that point. And she was really struggling trying to figure it out. And she said, my parents always taught me to know which of my friends would hide me in the attic. Right? So it's not just what would you do? You're an attic hider. I know if I knocked on your door and I would you. But it's not just knowing we would do it. It's knowing who in our lives would do it.
And
right?
it's not your Facebook friends.
No. No, not at all.
It's not your Instagram followers.
No.
It's not the people who liked your video on TikTok.
No, I know. So we didn't get a chance, my friend, to talk about the origins of the virus, which was a really great piece that Eugippius wrote. I love Eugippius. And then you wrote this completely game-changing piece on how they convinced Trump to lock down, which is so important because we need this forensic moment, and we're kind of doing it in the doc that you're going to be in that we're doing. But March 10th is the day, right? And we have to. Like, how did all of these people go from, do you have 10 minutes more to do this?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's do it. And let me just say that piece that I wrote, you can tell it's a mix of fact and speculation. But I have to say, and I welcome any readers to correct me at any point in this thing, but to the best of my knowledge, what I laid out there is what I think happened. As truthfully and honestly as I can say.
So what is your hypothesis? First of all, just to set the stage, Trump was sounding kind of like a Great Barrington person before March the 10th. Trump has good instincts. No one can deny that.
Now,
right?
the only thing about that's slightly different is that in January, he shut down travel from China and praised Xi Jinping's response to the virus. So, yeah. Okay. So that was true. So you've already got the something ticking in his brain that this is not good. This is trouble. We need to keep the virus out. He was already sort of responding as early as January as if this were AIDS, a virus that you would control and sort of keep. Now, as time went on, recall that in late January and early February, Fauci and Farrar, Daszak, and those kind of people all came to believe that there was a lab leak.
Yeah.
And so they alerted the FBI and the Justice Department. That sort of that whole biosecurity aspect of the state came into play at that moment.
So let's just stop. I just want to, sorry, Jeffrey, I just want to make clear what you just said. Yeah. So people because that's a pivotal thing. And that is that, and this comes from Jeremy Farrar's book and emails, there's all kinds of evidence for it, where he actually said we were using burner phones, right? They were so freaked out about it, the lab leak being a lab leak, but from a gain of function, but also that it might have been a bioweapon. Is that part of that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So now you had two lines that had to run simultaneously. You had an exoteric line and an esoteric line. So the exoteric line was that this wasn't a lab leak. This is zoonotic origin and just a regular virus, and don't worry about it. And Fauci continues this line all the way through February and even throughout the summer and the fall and the winter. But he writes it up for the New England Journal of Medicine, and his article appears on February 28th, but it had to been finished, a week or two earlier to get in there at that time, just the way the journals work. But during this time, they decided that the one way to protect themselves would be to minimize infections, through lockdowns. And then also, the vaccine manufacturers are already busy. Having sequenced the virus in January, they're already busy making their things. Now, they weren't talking to Trump at this point. So, because they never took Trump seriously. They always figured he was just a marionette on stage. That's the way the administrative bureaucrats always think. They don't pay any attention to elected politicians. So they were doing all this stuff behind the scenes. So already you had the FBI involved in the National Security Council and all the mucky mucks, were figuring out plans for lockdowns. it finally came to a breaking point on March 9th when Trump was by this time sick of all the panic and sick of all the freak out and everything else, and tweeted his Twitter habits were out of control. And he tweeted, look, a lot of people die from flu. It'll be the same thing with this thing, and we'll just go on with our lives. You know, everybody just shut up.
Yeah.
So that was on March 9th. And so at that moment was when they decided to come to him and tell him the bad news. And what that meant was that he was gathered around by some military mucky mucks and some people from the National Security Council and Fauci and a handful of others, and probably Kushner, maybe. I kind of doubt that, but, you know, certainly Pottinger was there and a few of these other guys. And they put down the code of silence, like in Get Smart episode, you know, and they swore him to secrecy and said, this is classified information and what you're about to hear, you don't want to hear, but it's what we have to tell you. And the reason we waited so long to tell you is that it is so secret, so classified, so here you go, Mr. President. He's like, tell me, I'm all ears. Well, we suspect this is a bioweapon from China, and it's a retaliation for all of your conflicts you've had with China, your tariffs, and all the things you've been doing. They've finally unleashed what we've long feared. We feared this for 20 years, that there would be a bioweapon attack on the United States, and that's what this is. So you need to shut up about how this is the flu. This is something much more serious.
So they blamed it on him. That's really an interesting tactic, because if they blamed it on him, then he's going to want to keep it a secret, right?
Yeah, that's right. So they say this is your doing. You thought they weren't going to retaliate. They have retaliated, and this is how they're retaliating. But there is good news. We do have a virus in production. We've already sequenced the virus. We've got the labs at work. It's not going to be long now. So here's the scenario we're going to lay out for you. You do what Xi Jinping did to Wuhan. He successfully controlled the spread, and now he's a hero to his people. You do that, you too will be a hero to your people, but you will especially be a hero when 600 million vaccines are distributed throughout this country. Everybody gets the shot. We get protected from the virus. Mr. President, there are some great presidents in American history. Lincoln, FDR, there's Reagan. There'll be nobody compared to you once you lock down, protect people from the virus, distribute that vaccine, fix everybody up, and then all that happens in time for your election in November. You will sweep in with an overwhelming landslide and go down in history as the bravest, boldest, greatest president in history.
Meanwhile, they've already, in my view, cut a deal with Pfizer that the vaccine announcement will post-date the actual election, so Trump won't get a win on the vaccine, right?
Moderna at least tried to release the vaccine earlier than the election, but Fauci intervened and delayed it and sent them back to trials because he said they didn't have enough racial diversity in their trial results. True story. So the vaccine comes out after the election. So Trump is trolled. But anyway, on March 11th, he tweeted out, we're going to use all power of the federal government to tackle this virus. The next day, he put in the travel restrictions against Europe, UK, New Zealand, and Australia. The following day, March 13th, the HHS distributes a document that had clearly been in preparation for many weeks prior. It's probably taken the whole month of February to write it, that took the CDC and the NIH out of a policy-making role in the virus response and put the National Security Council in charge. That was on March 13th, the same day as the national emergency was declared. In the U.S. context, what a national emergency means is still unclear, but basically there's an impression that the president can do whatever he wants, regardless of law and legislation. So he suddenly became a dictator over America. And then on the 13th and 14th, it was just a mop-up operation, just like, what do we tell the American people to do? That's when we know Pence was there. We had Fauci and Birx inevitably, but we also had Scott Gottlieb from Pfizer and Kushner and Kushner's two friends from the data industry. And as far as we know, that's all who were involved on the week of the 14th to 15th, I should say. Yeah, that was a Friday and a Saturday. And so that's when they wrote the sentence, the dreaded sentence, all indoor and outdoor venues where people congregate should be closed, quote unquote. And I've scoured the annals of misgovernment in the history of humanity and never seen anything so extreme, draconian, and outrageous as that one sentence. And that's what Trump released on the March 16th. But he did it under the expectation that, number one, the lockdowns would control the virus, and that number two, the vaccine would be coming very soon, sooner rather than later, no later than the summer, right? So he had it all mapped out in his head that this is what's going to happen. He only began to lose credulity towards this scenario by June. He was already starting to wonder if he had been trolled, and he indeed had been. But nonetheless, he's the one who gave the edict. He's the one who unleashed the lockdowns on the world. He had to believe that he did the right thing. So ever since then, he's been kind of trying to thread this needle, And he can't thread the needle. No, I mean, it's, and what's interesting about that, because I think his instincts were right. Mm-hmm. He brought Scott Alice in, and, there was some kind of peripheral stuff around focus protection. But what's interesting about it is, number one, they appealed to his vanity, which is his weak spot. He was never surrounded by particularly thoughtful people, which was another weak spot. And the third thing is what happened to many, many politicians and people in positions of governance around. It was kind of like the big COVID messaging extortion. They all knew, and this was confirmed to me by a local politician here who I admire very much, that they were backed into a corner because except for Ron DeSantis, but who didn't buy into it. But if they said that they were going to do focus protection and sort of guard all the vulnerable people and let everybody else go back to normal with some sort of minor public health things that they should be doing, and people died, they would be accused of killing people, right? And there was no evidence the lockdowns did much, but it was never clear enough in the minds of the media who were covering it that they could always blame the politician who tried to pull back, because there would always be deaths, right? So they knew they could do that, and they were all cowards. Nobody wanted to wear that shirt. Well, the great concession made very early on is that the goal was to minimize cases, that every new case was a disaster and a policy failure. So once you accept that, you're on a trajectory that was impossible to reverse, because it was inevitable from the very beginning that everybody would get this. And everybody had been getting it since October. It had been spreading. So there was no chance of containment, never. But they convinced him that was the goal. So now the media had this great story. Cases are going up. Cases are going up. Cases are going up. What are we going to do? Oh, no, this is very bad. This is very bad. This is very bad. We better have track and trace. Maybe we need more testing. We got to have more track and trace. And so on it went, for not 2 weeks, but 3 years. And incredibly, so at some point, the president was very frustrated, and this happened in April, late April. The president just went into Kushner and said, "Look, I'm fed up with this nonsense. I'm just going to announce a reopening right away." They said, I get it, but we have reopening plans. We're working on them right now. So if you just give us another day. So Kushner goes to Birx, and Birx goes to Fauci, and Fauci goes to the CDC. And so they mapped out a reopening plan, and I wrote about it the other day. This reopening plan was absurd. It was that it came in 3 phases, and basically the phase 1, you could open, at limited capacity. Businesses could open at limited capacity, but you could only start phase 1 if you'd been through 2 weeks of declining numbers of cases in the presence of either rising or consistent testing. Okay, so all those conditions had to be in place. Well, guess where that pertained to in the midst of a pandemic spread? I mean, pertained to nowhere. It's like nobody could go 2 weeks. And also, if you look back at the charts about cases, probably as inaccurate as they were, this is the lowest wave of cases. There were 2 and 3 and 4 much, much larger waves that would come in the future. So under the reopening plans, even if you got through those 2 weeks of declining cases with consistently rising tests, and also the tests were wildly inaccurate, PCR, they didn't test for cases, they tested for the presence of the virus, right? Which was everywhere at the time. So there was no possibility you could even get to stage 1. But even if you did, stage 2 would arrive. And then if your cases started rising again, you had to roll back.
Yeah, I mean.
So this was this so-called reopening plan was a plan for 3 years of closing. But Trump believed it was a reopening plan.
Yeah. Wow.
But it wasn't. I mean, I took it apart the other day in an article. It was a stay forever closed with rolling lockdowns plan is what that thing was. All premised on the idea of reduction of infections was the sole goal.
And now he's going after DeSantis, saying he locked down. He's like actually manufacturing what happened. But so I want to just switch quickly so we don't run out of time. But so then Eugippius, who I'm assuming you admire as much as I do, he's certainly a very smart guy writing from Europe, wrote a really interesting kind of caveat to what you wrote, which points out the writings of this guy. He was on our radar for the film we're doing. Thomas, I don't know if it's pronounced Pueo or Pueo. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, Thomas Pueo is the way I've always said it. Yeah.
Pueo, okay, who does this, to use your brilliant phrase, hair on fire, everybody's going to die kind of Medium article that as of 3/19/2020, it's received over 40 million views in the past week, 40 translations. It was absolutely pseudoscience. There was a video of him appearing on TV in the UK. He's like saying all of these insane things. And so I think the issue about that little piece of evidence being added to, I think it's called The Hammer and the Dance, this piece that he wrote, Pueo, is that it feels like there was some kind of deep state manipulation of that piece in order to get people why that piece by that guy? Why did that happen, right? What's your take on that?
It's a CIA operation. There's no way this guy wrote that article, by the way. I mean, it's just nobody even heard of this guy before.
Yeah.
Suddenly he had exactly the right phrase, the hammer, the dance, and all these charts and just an amazing pile of fake science that was all about the hammer, the dance. Lock down and then have a party, and that was actually the phrase that Trump used on March 16th. He said, "We'll lock down, we'll get rid of the virus, and we'll all have a party." So he was influenced by the hammer and dance. I think there's something to say for that. I don't think that Trump likely read that article, but that article framed it up in a sort of an intelligence service sort of way, as a way of compelling public messaging. And yes, that article in fact came out on the 10th. So it was all a setup. I think they were working for weeks ahead of time.
Yeah.
And just waiting for the moment to go into Trump and tell him that it was a bioweapon that he had to lock down. And that article was ready. And so on the 9th, after that tweet, Fauci calls up all of his friends and they say, okay, the moment has arrived. Now's the time. Let's go.
Yeah. Pull the trigger. I just want to wrap up by saying that I guess you know that Fauci has sold a book deal for $5 million. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, no.
$5 million. Yeah. Penguin. Penguin is the publisher of Liars now. I think they did Harry and Meghan, Harry's book, didn't they? Spare. I mean, full of lies. And now they're doing this. When is this going to end? Like the idea that he's making $5 million after what he did.
Yeah.
And then there was also just recently that great clip of him. I love this. I bet you did too. Going through some not very good neighborhood in DC for an American Masters, I think it was called, documentary, HBO, where he had a conversation with a working class, or maybe not even that, African-American man about vaccines. And I will tell you that the black guy ran rings around him and made him look like a complete fool. Right. But this was another hagiographical film about Fauci. And now he's going to put deal. When are you getting a $5 million book deal, Jeffrey? When am I getting one? We want that, don't we? I want to buy a country house and get away from all of this stuff.
Yeah. I wonder how much tax dollars we use to buy the book, right? One for every employee of the NIH will make it a bestseller.
Yeah, I know, right? Ugh. Anyway.
Well, so this is the problem. We're going to be dealing with these counter narratives for many, many years.
Yep.
I don't, friends of mine in sort of the anti-lockdown world say, "Oh, we've won." I mean, we're making progress. That's
we haven't
won.
I don't think we've won. We haven't won. If they're putting Eileen de Villa scarves in glass cases with heroification, what did you say, valorizing her in that way, we haven't learned a thing, because everybody's walking, they're escaping, away they go. Yeah.
I see that Washington Post reports yesterday that the entire coronavirus team for the Biden administration is preparing their exits now. They're not exiting in disgrace. They're just getting away from the crime scene. That's all.
Yeah, I'm picking up their bonuses on the way out, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Anyway, what a wonderful discussion this was with you. It was so good. I think I'm going to put a transcript of it up too on my Substack.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I really had a wonderful time, and I'm glad we finally got to the details of the Trump situation. Look, it's taken me 3 years to figure out all this stuff.
It's important. Yeah.
And there's a lot of people working on this, by the way.
I know.
mean, we at Brownstone, we have many, many researchers who are busy beavers every day figuring out all these details. There's a lot of things. Part of the problem is it's all shrouded in mystery and it's all locked away, because it was a national security response. Suddenly we can't have access to all the information. So, there's a little bit of speculation I'm doing here.
Yeah.
But as best we can tell, that's exactly what happened. And by the way, my little story there is not just built of my own facts and speculation, that of my team of researchers. I did have somebody come to me, a friend of a friend kind of situation, say, this is what I am told happened by somebody who was there.
Well, you see, I say this. I said it over the Uvalde shooting with a lot of enthusiasm, because the cops there were so disgusting. And I remember their first news conference, they refused to talk about anything. And I turned to my husband and I said, they're hiding something. They are not. What are they doing? And I said on the show, it's always about timelines. Once you start engaging with people and telling facts about a controversial event, then they can do a timeline. And it is the timeline always that screws people over, right? That's how you find out who the bad guys are, by knowing who did what when. And that's what you're doing at the Brownstone. Like March 10th is the day. Why that day? What happened? Who said what? My one question before I let you go is this, just about the bioweapon thing. So we know, I believe we still know that Fauci was funding EcoHealth and Peter Daszak was giving the money to the lab in Wuhan. If they were working on a bioweapon, are we to assume that Tony Fauci was funding a bioweapon in China, or that he didn't know it was a bioweapon, he just thought it was gain of function? What do we think about that?
There's no separating gain of function from bioweapons research. It's all the same. So gain of function research is done ostensibly for purposes of anticipating the next variant. But that's just a cover. What it really is bioweapons research. That's why they have to have gain of function methods to create the next virus. So there's, once again, an exoteric doctrine and an esoteric doctrine. So the ostensible purpose of gain of function is to get ahead of the new variant so we can have a vaccine for it. The actual reason for gain of function research is the creation of bioweapons. And there's no question that the U.S. and China had developed a very close relationship in cooperating on bioweapons research, because don't forget, we used to have a very close relationship with China. We did.
Yeah.
And Trump blew all that up, So.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think maybe the next time I have you on, we should talk about BRICS and the devaluing of American currency and what that actually means. I'm terrified by that stuff. And I kind of feel like emptying my bank accounts and putting all my money in gold, like those shysters say on TV every day. Are you buying gold bricks yet? Well, no, but I might start soon because that really scares me. And that's a weak spot of mine, right? Monetary policy, all that stuff is a weak spot of mine. So I would like to maybe pick your brain about that at some time in the future because I think it's going to be a big story and I'm sure you'll be writing about it, right?
Yeah. I write about it all the time. I try to divide my time between COVID history and philosophy and psychology, but also monetary analytics are a strength of mine. So,
where would you put your money now? Where are you putting your money now?
Well, you want first of all well-capitalized, reliable banks, but for the money that you spend. But the safest place right now is not actually in the banks. It's in the non-bank banks. So the Merrill Lynch's and Edward Jones's and these brokerage services. And those are much safer than conventional banks, actually.
What if the markets crash, though? Then what? So if we're really going primal here, like what? Yeah. Then what?
Well, every portfolio should be hedged against every eventuality. So, a balanced portfolio between, short-term treasuries, especially nowadays with interest rates on the rise, short-term treasuries are a good spot for your money.
Yeah.
They're not, the rates are not positive relative to inflation, but there's much better than these, much better than zero. So that's a decent place. And then the other two things that everybody always says is, it's good to, you'll feel a lot safer and a lot more protected at home if you've got a hidden stash of gold and silver. And then also, if you like this sort of thing, Bitcoin is a very good bet right now.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought it would come around.
Yeah, it's up 70% for the year.
Wow. Oh, I wish I bought at the bottom there. I'm such a coward. No. I'm not. I'm a person who buys when things are going up and sells. Like it's ridiculous.
It's just, It's just the way it is. Yeah.
Psychology. Anyway, thank you for this. I'm so grateful. And you're going to be in a great documentary we're working on too, and I'm grateful for that. Like, funnily, the story keeps changing so quickly. I'm like, are we going to be able to handle that new information? But we're going. So thank you. And it was nice to meet you in person in Toronto too.
Thank you for letting me be in your documentary and for inviting me to be on as part of it. I really appreciate it. I was very honored.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm always honored to have you on. So keep on going, and people should go to Brownstone. They are the place for people who think like us. So you should be going there and supporting them and reading them.
Thank you, Trish.
Bye. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay,
bye. So that was my friend, Jeffrey Tucker, telling you all about it, all about how it was difficult, but about how we need to march forward together with positive. He's much more positive and optimistic than I am, but I'm sure I'll get there. I'm really trying. I really am trying. And, it is Easter weekend, and this is Good Friday. It's supposed to be an optimistic day full of grace and mercy. So let's remember that and keep on going. One of the things I was privileged to be part of during COVID-19 was the sharing of people's experiences. And I got letters from people from all over the world thanking me for doing this show, and I am so grateful that they were listening and bothered to write to me. I just want to read one of them. I didn't get permission, so I'm not going to say his name, but I do want to just read it to you because I think we all need to remember forever where we were. They're not getting away with this. We're not just moving on. We're not going to forget it happened. It's not... I feel like one of those young men that we see who's had all their limbs blown off in Iraq, looking for WMDs that weren't there, and the whole country's moving on. I mean, people are building them houses, which is great, and they should, and more. But the country needs to give them a collective apology, which will never come because it never comes. Those apologies never come, my friends, and you know it. You know it's true. But I don't want to let the massive damage and ruination from these absolutely boneheaded and cruel policies go without forcing them on some level to recognize what they've done. They've put, as I said, they put Eileen de Villa's scarf in a box like a talisman we're supposed to pray at or something. This woman, I'm sorry, it's nothing against her personally, but most of what she did was wrong, and they were not doing risk-benefit ratios. And children suffered and will suffer. People suffered and died as a result of the restrictions in this city and in this province. And they won't, they're heroifying them. They are. They're beatifying them. They're going to be saints next. I mean, really? So I'm reading you this because someone took the time to let me know of their heartbreak, and I think we should share it. Just decided to write to you after listening to your podcast with Jackie Romboots and Julie Panesi. It was wonderful. I grew up near Watford in an even smaller town. I'm 55, and I have to say I was wondering what was happening to our country before COVID. Things were so much simpler, so much freedom. Common sense was naturally instilled in the home, school, and community. Hardly perfect, but looking back, so much of it made sense. You wanted to know how many of your listeners had trauma in their lives growing up. Well, my home was a home. My dad was quiet and sweet. Mom dealt out the discipline. And she was right. Life isn't a bowl of cherries. My dad's father was an alcoholic, and my uncle was a big, mean, abusive alcoholic. I remember my mom telling my drunk uncle to get the out of her house as I listened from the bottom of the basement stairs one Friday night. And he laughed and left. So I was probably talking about my alcoholism and my family's alcoholism in that show, which is why you wrote that. I had similar experiences. I am a sensitive, shy, smart, and very interested and stubborn person. But I'm a hardworking young man who ended up in a mental institution when I was 18 as I became suicidal. Looking back at my shame, I was just feeling sorry for myself, and I have to say it fits in with my way of learning things the hard way. And I'm glad it was during a time you didn't get a ribbon for it. Life is tragic. How else will anyone find grace and develop a backbone? Grace is what we need here. But COVID, this, even after making peace with it toward my mortality way back when it's totally off the scale. So many lies, starting with its place of origin, our medical professionals saying we have your back. It took almost a year to restrict travel, all the incompetence and corruption. The drug companies removed themselves from accountability for their new technology, and that piling on to the unaccountability of our elected officials, let alone our bureaucrats. These, what I think, make a sane person distrust what's going on. Yet here we are. I've been watching parents digest the lack of education, the danger or not these vaccines pose to their young children, healthy, strapping 20-year-olds getting the vax to just have the freedom to go to college or university, to face online classes, social distancing and restrictions, and to hear from hardworking kids they wish they had a choice breaks my heart. My daughter's wedding is in Toronto, October 9th. I'm not vaxxed, nor will I ever be, not willingly anyways. Hopefully I can get a rapid test that weekend, or else I'll be sneaking in to say a few words, regardless of the consequences, as she has earned it through her hard work and perseverance. Not that it matters, but she's gay. She struggled until she came out, and I knew anyways when she told me, and I was fine with it. Live your life, and don't expect a ribbon for who you are. Tough love, it's hard, but honestly rewarding. Both my girls work very hard. One question I do ponder is, where has the media been? How have they protected what's made this country great? How have they held all the players in all levels of government to task? How do they not see vaccine passports and an app on the phone you pay for doesn't pave the way for a communist social credit score and control? How? It's like a movie. They Live or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, with a country of Donald Sutherlands pointing their fingers at you and howling at you because you are a realist and an individual. To me, being a Canadian can be summed in a story I heard of: a soldier found tangled in the wire on the crest of Juno Beach, dead, with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and his lighter laying below him on the ground full of sand, and it wouldn't light, told by a CBC journalist, and it stirred my soul. If only I could be so brave. All the bent-over old people in my little town, work and toil, all the men I worked with from the day I dropped out of school until my brother booted my ass and got me out to work, that were kind to me after I earned it. Some of my most heartfelt things I heard about myself came from the roughest men, and I am supposed to tolerate the shallow self-entitlement kids have these days, the willingness of people not to question a new technology developed by people who won't stand behind it and sold to a population by people, it seems, who want to control people, not let them live free with the consequences of their own choices, especially when the vaccine doesn't prevent spread or transmission and may lead to even worse outcomes. And here we are, 18 months of what's next, and people wanting a normal that was better than now, but the reason now exists. We need change, and I value people like you, people that are skeptics, people that say the spoonful of progress modern leftists are feeding them is shit. And I will say the main reason this country is on the slide toward dystopia, along with people's apathy. My only hope is the truth, whatever that is. I feel in my heart and my soul it's what you and others try and instill in us, what you point out to us as a journalist and, more importantly, a Canadian. We are kind, but not blindly tolerant. When we fight, we win, if the cause is just. But it's going to be a long battle when it starts because we have slid so far into collectivism. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of being tolerant. I've been so patient, and God willing, I have the courage to make this the hill I die on. If not now, after so many disappointments and realizations of how we got here, then when? After the censorship bill, the tracking app, your home is your gulag, and they don't have to sneak you off at night under the noses of the vegetables by the organ that controls them. We need more souls like you and the two women you had on. People need to listen. People need to sit up straight and say no. People need to remember where they come from and how people found grace in so much hardship and tragedy while calling it what it is. Life lived freely. Thank you, Trish, from the bottom of my heart. What a great letter. So let's ponder that. Think about the day today, Good Friday, and as our writer was suggesting, and that is that we stay critical. I'll see you next week.